well, I was hoping that things would be a little less fluid when I went, and I kind of timed it so that the ground invasion would have started by then and maybe even reached another level of where the needs would be and where the security issues would be. And I don't know. I mean, we'll see. But we're up on Facebook now, everybody, and begin in a sec. Still letting a couple of people in. I don't know. Does anybody want to say anything before we officially start? We are streaming, but again, after giving you some of the health updates, I hope that everybody else stays healthy.
Hey, congratulations on the most influential 51.
Thank you. Thank you. I moved up. What people don't know is I'm killing off the people in front of me so I can be the most. What was it? Killing the great chefs of Europe. That's what I'm doing right now. No, I somehow moved up on the ranking, which was, I mean, it's very nice. Richard Budman, the publisher, has been very helpful to the synagogue, and he's just been very supportive over the years. So I thanked him for including me, and it's more of a thing that my kids tease me about, whether I've gone up or down. So I have to maintain my ranking, otherwise my kids make fun of me. It's like the power rankings, we check the power rankings in football. So she's, it's more for my kids to hopefully they'll give me more respect now. If I move down, I get garbage from them. So we'll see. And I get garbage from them anyways. It doesn't really matter. maybe it's I just said that and I got an alert.
Don't trash your kids on Facebook.
No, I know.
That's mean.
I know they'll never watch this, but I just got the NFL power rankings, and I actually I'm curious. I want to see if the Vikings moved up. They lost their quarterback, and I wonder, can they go up? Can they go down after? Yeah, they went down. They went down because they lost their quarterback. So yeah, they won, but and in Green Bay, but they went down. Anyways, that happens. That happens in life. You think you're going up, but you're not going up. Anyways, well, we're going to start because I know Rosemary's got to be out here a little early. I'll maybe read a little bit past, depending on what we're doing. But as I mentioned over the last couple of weeks, we're reading a part of Ezekiel where Ezekiel is addressing Israel in particular. And I say Israel in particular because we're about to get into a section, maybe even today, where Ezekiel is not talking to Israel anymore, believe it or not. He's talking to he's still talking to Israel, but he's talking to Israel about other people. He's talking to them, like we saw in Jeremiah and Isaiah, about other nations. And, it's kind of interesting that our prophets didn't just talk to us, but we'll take a look at those. And then what Ezekiel does, which is interesting, is he goes from kind of talking about them in a more us and them in a more harsh way, and then it flips into a more hopeful way, both for us and for the nation. So in chapter 33, that's going to flip. We'll see in a couple of weeks when it flips. And but for right now, we're going to read the last. I called it Judgment on Israel, part 4, because I wasn't sure whether we'd have 3 or 4 parts to this, but this is the 4th part and the last part. So today, for the next couple of chapters, similar to what we've been reading the last few weeks, with his judgments being directed at Israel, and like I said, maybe we'll get into the to the judgments against other people. And yeah, any other questions or comments or anything? I'm going to make this a bit bigger so people can see. But let's roll then.
The word of God came to me. Further, O mortal, arraign the city of bloodshed. Declare to her all her abhorrent deeds. Say, thus said the sovereign God, O city in whose midst blood is shed, so that your hour is approaching, within which fetishes are made, so that you have become impure. You stand guilty of the blood you have shed, defiled by the fetishes you have made. You have brought on your day. You have reached your year. Therefore, I will make you the mockery of the nations and the scorn of all the lands.
Yeah, that's not a good open. Yeah, it's not a happy opening, right? This is again why this is judgment against Israel. And you can see again, his issue is very clearly the idolatry that these people are engaged in. It is maybe more pronounced in Ezekiel than it was in Jeremiah and Isaiah, the two prophets that we've studied so far, only because Isaiah and Jeremiah have some other issues. Isaiah definitely focuses on the way people are not only worshiping God the wrong way, but he also seems to be very fixated on their behavior in Isaiah. And in Jeremiah, it's not only their idolatry and their ethical behavior being messed up, but in Jeremiah, it's almost a personal vendetta, because we read about how Jeremiah gets treated, and it's almost as if and I'm not saying that's his motivation. Clearly, he was doing stuff prophetically that was getting him into trouble. But Jeremiah almost has like a bone to pick with these people who are torturing him and arresting, doing these terrible things to him. So Ezekiel, it's much more pronounced, the issue of idolatry. And again, consider the fact that he's giving his prophecy to people that aren't living in the land of Israel. So he's not talking to them about what's happening for them necessarily in these other lands they're living, other than the fact that if they couldn't keep true to God while they were in Israel, you have to ask yourself, what are they going to do when they're not in Israel? So there is that thing to keep in mind, that there's both this issue of idolatry, and then for Ezekiel prophesizing to Jews in the diaspora, it's like, well, what are you going to think about it? But he is talking about the stuff that you did in the land of Israel, and again, how you're now finally, as we said, the time has come. And of course, for him, the time already came, and for his family and for his group of exiles, they're already out. But again, he's talking about what it's going to be like when the temple is destroyed and everyone of consequence is going to be exiled. And I say of consequence because we know not everybody was exiled, but at least the leadership, the royalty, the priests, the leaders of the community are eventually taken into Babylonian exile. So that's, it's interesting, again, remembering that Ezekiel is speaking to people unlike Jeremiah and unlike Isaiah that we've read, he's already speaking to people in exile. All right, so people are going to hear about it, and Israel will be a mockery, right?
Both the near and the far shall scorn you, O besmirched of name, O laden with iniquity. Every one of the princes of Israel in your midst used his strength for the shedding of blood. Fathers and mothers have been humiliated within you. Strangers have been cheated in your midst. Orphans and widows have been wronged within you. You have despised my holy things and profaned my Sabbaths. Base men in your midst were intent on shedding blood. In you they have eaten on the mountains, and they have practiced depravity in your midst. In you they have uncovered their father's nakedness. In you they have violated women during their menstrual impurity. They have committed abhorrent acts with other men's wives. In their depravity, they have defiled their own daughters-in-law. In you, they have violated their own sisters, daughters of their fathers. They have taken bribes within you to shed blood. You have taken advance and accrued interest. You have defrauded your fellow Israelites to your profit. You have forgotten me, declares the sovereign God.
Yeah, and that seems to be a little bit of a break, but Neum Adonai, I mean, that phrase we have at the end. But, the next part doesn't begin with another, and thus, and God's, this is what God has said. So we don't have that in the next line, but you can see this list of things that they've done. They've broken now all of these laws that are in the Torah, not just 10 commandment laws, but other laws that are also there. And there you can see him saying that you've done all these things in addition to idolatry, including idolatry, but also in addition to idolatry, you've done all these other things. And we're reading about a lot of these commandments in the book of Deuteronomy right now. And so this is a reference back to the laws that are not just in, not just in the 10 Commandments, not just in the book of Exodus, but laws that we really only find in Leviticus and then Deuteronomy. So what's interesting about this is that for people who study kind of like how the Bible was edited, when you see references to laws that are in parts of the Bible that might have come, these parts might have come from other sources. What source they come from? What appears is that these laws were in such a way that these are not all from one author, for those who study the documentary hypothesis. The reason, again, why this is important is the documentary hypothesis puts forward the idea that the Torah wasn't edited until Ezra comes back with the community from exile. So about 100 years, not quite 100 years after this, right, is when most people believe the Torah was edited. So that means that if the Torah wasn't edited yet, the 5 books, if the Torah wasn't edited yet, somehow Ezekiel knows laws that don't just come from one author. So that's an important thing to think about when people talk about this. It doesn't mean that the documentary hypothesis isn't true. It just means that these books must have existed, these laws must have existed before Ezekiel lived. And no one thinks that Ezekiel lived later than he did. I mean, there's no reason to believe that this wasn't written by a guy who has not seen the temple be restored. We'll get to that when we get to his description of the temple being restored, because it's not the temple that got built. So if the temple that he described was the temple, that wouldn't make any sense. So, most people are pretty set that Ezekiel was written, around 600 BCE, not 450 or 500 when the Torah would have been edited. So it's important from that standpoint to understand that there's things in here that kind of show us that people did understand the laws, not just, or couldn't have been, if it wasn't like they sat down and read the Torah yet. And so, there's definitely stuff in here that's only in Deuteronomy, which would have, according to the documentary hypothesis, only been out for, 20 years from the time of King Josiah, who's these guys' father. So just keep that in mind. I mean, I'm not saying the document, I believe that much of the documentary about the hypothesis is probably true based on historical evidence, but this is just interesting to also consider. So here we go. If any questions about this, please interrupt, please. All right.
Lo, I will strike my hands over the ill-gotten gains that you have amassed, and over the bloodshed that has been committed in your midst. Will your courage endure? Will your hands remain firm in the days when I deal with you? I, God, have spoken, and I will act. I will scatter you among the nations and disperse you through the lands. I will consume the impurity out of you. You shall be dishonored in the sight of nations, and you shall know that I am God.
Yeah. Now that, as you can see from the next line, seems to be the end of that prophecy or that section. And again, pretty consistent with what we've read in other parts of Ezekiel, that he's, the exile is your punishment for this, and it's the necessary end to this behavior, and this is the punishment. So
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yeah.
If you scroll back 2 paragraphs, right? The first one, I'm sorry, I keep going back to Noah. When it's scatter among the nations, which you just read, which you just discussed, and discover thy father's nakedness, right?
Yeah. It's a good one, right? Because that's exactly what happens to Noah, right?
Right. I mean, that's
that phrase is,
I mean, that's where this all started. I mean, you have to go back, right? That's where this all started.
Yeah, and it is an interesting phrase. We do get the phrase in Leviticus, and when the phrase is used in Leviticus, it's actually in Achrei mode in one of your son's portions, when it goes through the laws of who you're supposed to be married to and who you're not supposed to be married to, or really who you're not supposed to be married to. One of the things it says is when it goes through your relatives that you're not supposed to have relations with, it uses that phrase, uncovering your father's nakedness, which in Noah literally means that Noah's son saw him naked, or I can
Who knows?
say maybe even worse, but
right.
I was just wondering whether that's an okay thing to say anymore. But yes, there's no, whatever it was worse than seeing your father naked, right? So that phrase is there, it's used literally. In the other parts in Leviticus, it's clear that it's a symbolic shaming, by the sense that, where, for example, it talks about not having relations with your aunt, for example, that's considered a problem because it's your father's sister, and the Bible says it's essentially uncovering it's uncovering his nakedness when you do it. So I'll just show you very briefly, since we're here in the Bible. So yes, as John says, it's literally a problem in Noah, in Genesis, and then, but the uncovering the nakedness is,
I wouldn't have brought it up until you had said scattered among the nations.
No, right?
It's to me, it's the same thing.
Yeah. So it says right here, you do not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is the nakedness of your father. That's your stepmother, the nakedness of your sister. And then, it's your father's sister, your aunt. It's your father's flesh. So it's not just your aunt, it's also kind of, seeing your father naked too. So, there's the phrase, and it's a similar phrase because the Bible is fairly euphemistic when it talks about that kind of stuff, right? So it doesn't it uses the same phrase, ervat, the ervat av, the nakedness of your father. So erva means naked, and then your father. So but again, it's the sexual issues, the ethical issues, and then of course the the idolatry and the worshiping of other gods yeah, and so hopefully this experience of exile, once you're scattered among the nations, and again, as John says, it's kind of reminding us of the Noah story, because Noah, after his nakedness is uncovered to some extent, though it's not necessarily the driving force for it, his family is then spread around the world, and which is accelerated by chapter 11 of Genesis, which is the story of the Tower of Babel. So
I actually thought it was the accelerant that started this whole thing.
what, the tower?
No, the Noah and
Well,
and his,
I mean,
I mean,
I don't know if it's
I mean,
I don't know if it's the accelerant. It's the explanation for how the other nations came to be, because the Bible essentially kind of answers the question that people said, which was, well, if everyone else died during the flood, that means Noah's family is the ancestor to everybody. And so they then divided up the world as they knew it amongst Noah's sons and explained how his family, becomes the ancestor of everybody, with the different sons being the different, the three main branches, the Semites, the Japhethites, and the Hamites. And so the three sons become three not just families, but like the three ethnicities, if you will. And the Asians are not mentioned. The people of the Americas are not mentioned. The people of Australia are not mentioned. So
yeah, no, but my point was on that, and really not to go down a rabbit hole, but but we may, I guess. But for that not happening, right? God wouldn't have scattered them to the other lands, and everybody would be Jewish and Israelites. That's my point.
Yeah,
right?
that's another interesting point, right? That's another.
There'd be no reason for God to reach out to Abraham and make him right.
Right.
For me, that's the start of anyway.
No,
I mean, I think
okay,
you get my point.
No. So that's interesting, because that chapter 11 is the Tower of Babel, and chapter 12 is Abraham. So the Bible, at least in the book of Genesis, or the intention of Genesis, so obviously there's a lot of midrash. We've studied that too. There's a lot of midrash about this, but what's interesting is that what happens is when and I think John's point is, once the people are there, once the world is kind of laid out, then the book of Genesis immediately turns to our family, right? And to explain how our family got to be. The connection to Shem is very important. The connection of Noah being a descendant of Shem, super important. And then Shem's descendants then being the Semites, the ancestor of the Persians, the Arabs, people of the Middle East. Many of those peoples we don't know anymore, but they've kind of been limited now to Arabs and Jews, if you will. Most of the other ethnicities and tribes, maybe the Kurds, who aren't actually originally Middle Eastern, by the way. So when we look at how the world kind of gets to the way it is, then the Bible spends that time kind of introducing us to our ancestor, and then the connections that he has to the Ammonites and the Moabites, the Edomites. All of that is there. And I've said this before. I mean, it's an interest of mine, because I'm interested in the ethnicities that are mentioned in the Bible. I was, always, if I ever wrote my own thesis for my professors and the documentary hypothesis, I was actually going to write about what the documentary hypothesis says about these other nations, how we learn about the authors through their treatment of Ammonites or Moabites or Midianites, especially the Midianites. The problem, of course, is that as I thought about it, 5 people would want to read that. And so that's one of the reasons why I did not become a professor of Bible, because I was very worried that things I would do would have little to no interest amongst other people. But it is an interesting thing that you can actually see how different authors treat other nations, some not well at all, and none of them well. And then others, are kind of trying to explain how we're all related and part of one big family. And I don't mean like the authors of the prophetic books. I'm talking about the authors in the Torah itself, in the 5 books, how they treat it. But again, it's not just in the 5 books, it continues. So, yeah. By the way, my wife has COVID. She's fine, but I'm just now, and she's fine, and I'm not with her right now, so it's even weirder. But not that there's anything I can do, and she's feeling fine for the 5th time, but she is positive, so that now we have to deal with the consequences of that. Like the consequence of, do I have anything do I see her for the next 48 hours or whatever? That's the weird thing, is whether you have to be quarantined from your own family. But we'll figure it out. Anyways, there's nothing we can do right now and again, she's fine. I don't want anyone to say she's like fine. So especially after I gave you the health report for everybody at the beginning. But anyways, so let's take a look at this other section of chapter 22, which is definitely another prophecy.
The word of God came to me. O mortal, the house of Israel has become dross to me. They are all copper, tin, iron, and lead. But in a crucible, the dross shall turn into silver.
Yeah, now that's an interesting image, because he did say earlier, right, or in the previous one, that you're going to be, I will scatter you and I will consume the impurity out of you, which again, the word tame is the word we use for impurity. There also seems to be this kind of idea of like a crucible, that when you make metal, you have to kind of burn it, and then when you burn it, well, in this it seems to imply that like it, I don't know that this is really the translation is silver, but even here it says the meaning of Hebrew is uncertain. What it probably is really alluding to, the fact that sometimes when you melt one metal, you get other metals out of it that are more valuable than the metal that you put into it. And sometimes that's because like the metal that you want comes out, or sometimes by melting it and combining it with other stuff, it becomes a harder metal, especially like, well, like bronze, but which they're kind of talking about some of the ingredients like copper and iron that go into bronze. But and again, we call these different ages, the Stone Age, the Iron Age, the Bronze Age. As the metal got better, we saw that as increases in civilization and the steps of civilization. But so there is that, but there also is this kind of idea. It seems to be, again, with the word that they translated as dross, which is the stuff that's not worth something, that sometimes there's a metal that can only be gotten by melting the other metals, and then this other more precious metal kind of rises, and they're able to get out some metal that you otherwise couldn't get. So the word kesef is silver, and it also is money now in Hebrew. The word kesef means money, but in Hebrew it literally means, it's the word for silver. So is it's we're not sure, but that's why it's a meaning of Hebrew uncertain. But here's again, as we see in Ezekiel, sometimes he uses these metaphors, this imagery, and uses these kinds of images to give us a powerful lesson. Some of it is tough to read, especially when Jews were burned literally during the Holocaust and 30 weeks ago. It's hard to read this sometimes, and like the imagery of it. And I'm sure there were Jews that were burned during the capture of Jerusalem, the destruction during his times. I'm sure he saw horrific things. But so sometimes the metaphor, the imagery, even though it's meant to be poetic and it's meant to not be taken literally, is sometimes hits you as not as it's tough to read. Would not necessarily be my choice of images if I was a prophet, but prophets are not easy to read. Their job is not to make people feel comfortable. It's kind of the exact opposite. They're meant to upset us. So as I said, to comfort the
afflicted and afflict
the comfortable. So that's their job. But this imagery, especially now, is tough. So here we go.
Assuredly, thus said the sovereign God, because you have all become dross, I will gather you into Jerusalem. As silver, copper, iron, lead, and tin are gathered into a crucible to blow the fire upon them so as to melt them, so will I gather you in my fierce anger and cast you into the fire and melt you. I will gather you and I will blow upon you the fire of my fury, and you shall be melted in it. As silver is melted in a crucible, so shall you be melted in it. And you shall know that I, God, have poured out my fury upon you.
Yeah. It's a very, very, very graphic image. Very powerful. If he said, I'm going to melt you in a crucible, that's tough to read, and it's hard, it's hard to read. But this image of God blowing like fire, like the billows of a flame in a smith's shop, and not just that there's fire and that there's you see that, but like literally it's like blowing on you, this heat, this fire just coming at you. That's what he just said. So it's very, very, very powerful imagery. And it's not just, when you think about it from a literary standpoint, it's very hard to find this kind of writing today. It's just very, very powerful and very it's the literary level to it is amazing.
The word of God came to me. O mortal, say to her, you are an unpurified land, not to be washed with rain on the day of indignation. Her gang of prophets are like roaring lions in her midst, rending prey. They devour human beings. They seize treasure and wealth. They have widowed many women in her midst. Her priests have violated my teaching. They have profaned what is sacred to me. They have not distinguished between the sacred and the profane. They have not taught the difference between the impure and the pure, and they have closed their eyes to my Sabbaths. I am profaned in their midst. Her officials are like wolves rending prey in her midst. They shed blood and destroy lives to win ill-gotten gain. Her prophets, too, daub the wall for them with plaster. They prophesy falsely and divine deceitfully for them. They say, thus said the sovereign God, when God has not spoken.
So let's look at what he just did, right? He took every class of society, well, almost, he's taken the top tiers of society. He's taken, if we look at the caste system as it existed in ancient Israel, right? He took the priests, right? Well, he mentioned the prophets there, but he's going to mention them again. her priests, her officials, right? Her government officials, right? The people who are supposed to be, administering justice, right? Are wrong, are doing bad things, or they're and then the prophets, they're lying, right? So the priests, the prophets, and the officials, those are the three tiers. Those are the three leadership positions, right? In ancient Israel. Okay, that's who it is. But check this out.
And the people of the land have practiced fraud and committed robbery. They have wronged the poor and needy, have defrauded the stranger without redress.
So it's not just the top tiers, right? It's everybody. And the phrase that they use for the common person is Am Haaretz. And that phrase is a phrase that's used throughout rabbinic literature. We've seen it already in Ezekiel, but it becomes the phrase to describe, during the rabbinic period in particular, to describe, it's the title for the population as a whole. So this phrase, Am Haaretz, or this title, this appellation and class, this description becomes the description for the common man. That's the word that we would use. Well, I don't know that we use that word today, but we used that word in English for a long time. The common man, and in Hebrew it's Am Haaretz, a person of the land. It didn't mean that they were just farmers, for sure, because again, based on the descriptions, even based on the description here, it doesn't have to be a farmer that does this. Actually, this seems to be someone who's more engaged in commerce than it does a farmer, but they were engaged in commerce. But this seems like somebody who just lives in a city almost, or somebody who's doing more commercial transactions. But yeah, this means everybody. It's not like the rich people are behaving bad and the poor people are poor people. They're oppressed, and no, it's everybody. And so that's tells you everybody. It's not like a class distinction in goodness here. And that means he's calling everybody out. But again, I just also want you just to learn this phrase in Hebrew, because the phrase still exists in Hebrew and in Yiddish. The word in Yiddish, Am Haaretz, becomes like a known for, like if you called someone even during the 1800s an Am Haaretz, it meant that they were a simple person. They weren't an intellectual. They weren't a leader. They weren't they were a common guy. They'd say, yeah. And if you talked about like your wife's family, they're Am Haaretz. They're people of the land. But of course, it meant they were common people. They were not high up. And so that phrase continues up through Yiddish, and even to some extent, even in the rabbinic communities today, when people are describing people who aren't familiar with Jewish law, they will call people in modern Israel, an Am Haaretz. If somebody is not living a rabbinic life, not living an observant life, they'll call them Am Haaretz, which sometimes is pejorative, but oftentimes is kind of like seen as they just don't know any better. But it did to some extent, once we didn't have kings anymore, once we didn't have priests anymore, once we didn't have prophets, what becomes the distinction between Am Haaretz? The rabbis, the rabbinic followers, and people who are following Jewish law, and then on the other side, Am Haaretz. So it becomes less of a class distinction and more of like a behavioral, or to some extent religious distinction for people who didn't follow Jewish law. They were called Am Haaretz, as in some cases as well. So even, like I said, even today. So just understand that this phrase is loaded with meaning. and it starts to develop again in this period. This is where the first times we see it. We don't see it in the Torah itself. The Torah, the 5 books, don't refer to people as Am Haaretz. It's not until we get to the exilic period where people start making these distinctions to some extent, because they're saying, look, we definitely have a class system. We definitely have people who have different obligations and there's different things that are going to happen to them too, different consequences. What's interesting is, to some extent, there's then this other thing that you're going to see a little bit of, but you just know it, and it's in the background. It's the wealthy people, it's the leaders, the political leaders, it's the religious leaders that are taken into exile. The Am Haaretz in Israel are to some extent left behind, right? So what's interesting is that what you actually have then left in the country is, when the Babylonians exile people, is the people who were the lower class people. So it creates an interesting, like, well, what's here and what's not here, and so Ezekiel, being from a family of priests, he's not Am Haaretz, right? He's not one of those people. And as I said, that's what's going on here. But again, the words are used throughout the rest of Jewish history, and again, take on other meanings as the community changes. But the phrase doesn't go away. The phrase becomes part of Jewish understanding. And we don't use it very much today, by the way. We don't use it much. First of all, a lot of you probably have never heard that phrase, and that's because we don't make a distinction in the non-Orthodox world between people who are followers of Jewish law and who aren't. We just don't. So we don't make that distinction. We'll say someone's observant. We'll say somebody is Shomer Shabbos. We'll say different things about their observance, but we don't call the person an Am Haaretz. I've never heard a reformer or conservative rabbi say, "Oh, don't worry about it, they're Am Haaretz." Wait, let me say that again. I haven't heard it much. I won't say I've never heard it, but it's a pretty pretentious thing to say, and it's kind of a ridiculous thing to say, because I don't know many Reform or conservative rabbis whose families aren't made up of a whole lot of Am Haaretz, because there's a lot of Jews in our community who are not knowledgeable about law, and it's okay. We don't make these judgments and say, well, don't worry about it, they're just Am Haaretz. We don't say that. I will tell you that in rabbinic dialogue, where people will talk about, and very rarely I've heard it, where there is this kind of like, well, I've seen it. I'm going to be very honest. I've seen it more in the New York Jewish community, maybe not even so much as it applies to religion, but as it applies to people who are steeped in Jewish community and Jewish culture, in which case everyone who lives outside of Manhattan, Brooklyn, is Am Haaretz. But I have kind of heard that. But that's really as much as you'll get in the non-Orthodox world of what it means to be that. So anyways, for the purposes of here in Ezekiel, it's the people who are the common person. But just know that phrase, and just know it doesn't go away. But right now, it's they're not good either. Yeah.
And I sought someone among them to repair the wall, or to stand in the breach before me in behalf of this land, that I might not destroy it. But I found none. I have therefore poured out my indignation upon them. I will consume them with the fire of my fury. I will repay them for their conduct, declares the sovereign God.
Yeah, he says, I didn't find anybody there who was capable of stopping this destruction. As he says, stand in the breach. It's a very famous phrase, right? Stand in the breach, to be a person who can stop that. So that's Omed Ba Peretz. The name Peretz, the word Peretz in Hebrew, means breach. And to stand in the breach is to stop destruction. It's to stop people from going over the edge, if you will. So I couldn't find it. Can you read a little bit more, Rosemary, or are you done?
I can read a little more.
Okay, thanks. Because this is the end of one prophecy. Clearly, it's not just the end of a chapter, but we had that phrase that he uses, Neum Adonai, Adonai, the Lord God. They translate it as sovereign God. But again, the word Adonai we use is the Yud He Vav He name, and he actually calls him Lord Hashem or Lord, Yud He Vav He. He calls him that, right? So that's the phrase that he uses over and over again. And then he begins the prophecies oftentimes with this phrase that we have, Vayihi Davar Adonai Elai Le'amor. God spoke to me, right? God, the word of God comes to me. And that's the way these prophecies begin. So here we go.
The word of God came to me. O mortal, once there were two women, daughters of one mother. They played the whore in Egypt. They played the whore while still young. There their breasts were squeezed, and there their virgin nipples were handled.
Fairly graphic. This isn't the first time we've had Ezekiel talk about breasts, as we mentioned a couple weeks ago. It's actually the phrase that we then makes its way into the Haggadah. And whenever I read that with kids, we get a little uncomfortable, where it quotes Ezekiel in the Midrash in the explanation of Kitavo, and they bring in those verses from Ezekiel about again Israel being compared to a woman who becomes a whore. In this, of course, there's two women, right? Daughters of one mother. It's Judah and Israel. It's Israel, Judah and Israel, however you want to say it. Israel's already been exiled. Remember, exiled 150 years earlier by the Assyrians, and the Judahites are the ones who are now in the process of being exiled. So, where do they start their whoredom? Where did they start this? And again, this word zonah, the phrase zanu, the verb,
Hey, Rabbi, I have a question.
Yeah.
Far be it from me to be the prude, which I'm not, right?
Right.
But what's the point? I mean, 3,000 years old. They're just, and if we fast forward, are we going to have like a reasoning? I mean, what we see this.
Well, so
I'm just wondering.
Why
poetry, John.
Yeah, no. This is to get
No,
people.
seriously, it's imagery.
Yeah, this is to get people to
The
pay
sex
attention.
sells.
You are paying attention.
Even back then, Rosemary.
Yes.
Oh, we wouldn't be here if it didn't.
So yeah, this is pretty graphic stuff, as we saw before. His description of a woman being kind of cultivated. The whole thing is like, even the parts of it that are not meant to be, that they probably didn't have a problem with. It's not that we've become prudes. We've also we've to some extent become less tolerant for some behaviors that we would see as,
They didn't really think there was anything wrong with marrying off people at 12 or even 10. So
yeah, thanks. Thanks for saying it so I didn't have to.
But they also died at 20.
Okay,
yeah,
we're gonna. Yeah, I mean, it's just stuff. It's hard stuff. It's hard stuff for us to.
But that's dancing around my question. My question is, I just find it very hard to think back then that a prophet is going to discuss such things. Actually, Judith, you bring up a very good point. If life was so short, why is this, right, even being discussed? I mean, just trying to get in the weeds here. Move on. It's fine.
No.
I just don't.
But it's a good question, because the answer is real important, which is that the prophets spoke in the language that the people would understand, right? So that's one of the things that the prophets, especially I mean, like we're concerned with the Israelite prophets. We know that there were prophets for other religions, but what's interesting about, again, what our prophets did was that they spoke to everybody. They spoke to all levels of society, and they used imagery and they used language that the people would understand. And as we saw with Ezekiel, they actually did performances. I mean, we're going to get to some other prophets who do stuff that combines all this. It combines well, at least it says it does. There's people who say that didn't really happen. But when we get to the prophet Hosea, he does performance stuff to some extent, performance or lives this stuff, and it's prostitution. So yeah, people definitely paid attention to sex, got people's attention, and he doesn't just talk about sex. He's talked about metal. He's talked about farm produce. He's talked about lots of imagery, lots of images,
and those make sense, right? I just did.
You don't think there were prostitutes in ancient Babylon?
No. That's not my point. That's not my point. We went from I don't know. Whatever, doesn't matter.
No. But again, I will tell you, it's an important question, and what's interesting about it, and again, thanks for kind of like bringing our attention to it. The prophets, the prophets do this. They force us to look at all aspects of life through their words, and in this case, this one is like the other one we read, John. I mean, you can imagine. Look, for a man to read this, it's tough, but for a father of daughters, it's even tougher to some extent, because the way he's describing this, for a man who has daughters, he's basically, well, I mean, it's tough. It's a tough one to read. And it's really tough because the consequences of this are real. So look what he I mean, he doesn't hide what he's talking about. It's like, he's telling you this imagery, but watch what he does.
Their names were the elder one, Oholah, and her sister, Oholibah. They became mine, and they bore sons and daughters. As for their names, Oholah is Samaria, and Oholibah is Jerusalem.
So you can see, I mean, says what they are. And again, Oholah is a version of tent, and Oholibah is, my tent is in her. So those were the names. And again, in the images here, it's God. Their God is the husband of these two sisters. Now, again, you're not supposed to be married to two sisters, but for the sake of the image, that's what we are. And we're God's wives, and we were not good wives. But the relationship brought children into the world, which are the people.
Oholah whored while she was mine, and she lusted after her lovers, after the Assyrians, warriors clothed in blue, governors and prefects, cavalry troops, all of them handsome young fellows. She bestowed her favors upon them, upon all the pick of the Assyrians, and defiled herself with all their fetishes after which she lusted. She did not give up the whoring she had begun with the Egyptians, for they had lain with her in her youth, and they had handled her virgin nipples, and had poured out their lust upon her. Therefore I delivered her into the hands of her lovers, into the hands of the Assyrians, after whom she lusted. They exposed her nakedness, they seized her sons and daughters, and she herself was put to the sword. And because of the punishment inflicted upon her, she became a byword among women.
Okay, so not a good ending to Oholah, the first sister, the one who went off with the Assyrians. So this is really tough. It's tough to read. It's tough imagery. It's tough to think about the consequences of this. But it's very powerful. I would argue it's very effective. And again, in this story, You should have learned from the first sister. You should have learned from your older sister.
Her sister Oholibah saw this, yet her lusting was more depraved than her sister's, and her whoring more debased. She lusted after the Assyrians, governors and prefects, warriors gorgeously clad, horsemen mounted on steeds, all of them handsome young fellows. And I saw how she had defiled herself. Both of them followed the same course, but she carried her whoring further, for she saw men sculptured upon the walls, figures of Chaldeans drawn in vermilion, girded with belts round their waists and with flowing turbans on their heads, all of them looking like officers, a picture of Babylonians whose native land was Chaldea. At the very sight of them, she lusted after them, and she sent messengers for them to Chaldea.
And again, this is what Judah did. And we read about this. We read about how the kings of Judah, especially King Hezekiah, started doing these things with the Babylonians, allying themselves with them, basically, turning himself over to them. And so, in this imagery, it's a woman, but we know the guys who did it. I mean, we read about them in the book of Kings. And so, even though the Babylonians are agents of God, we weren't supposed to be messing with them. We weren't supposed to be hanging around them.
So the Babylonians came to her for lovemaking and defiled her with their whoring, and she defiled herself with them until she turned from them in disgust. She flaunted her whoring and exposed her nakedness, and I turned from her in disgust, as I had turned disgusted from her sister.
Yeah. Again, this is the idolatry and the relationships that Israel had and Judah had is what is making God sick. So that's the imagery. It's meant to be powerful. It's meant to be upsetting. It's meant to make us say, oh, so God looks at us the way this husband would look at his wife. And again, John, to some extent, it's because it's being laid on men to hear this. I mean, not that women won't learn from it. It's not like women would say, "Oh, I don't get what you're talking about." But for a guy, Ezekiel's really trying to hit him in the gut. He's really trying to make him feel this, which is this is the way God feels. God feels like the husband, not that just the wife cheated on him, but becomes a prostitute. That's what this is like. It's very, very powerful. Very powerful and very upsetting.
But she whored still more, remembering how in her youth she had played the whore in the land of Egypt. She lusted for concubinage with them, whose members were like those of donkeys and whose organs were like those of stallions.
Interesting.
Oh, come on now.
I will only tell you.
On. You know what? I wouldn't have believed anybody who said that this was in the Torah or the Bible unless I read it with my own eyes.
Now you have. And now you have. And you can see that for the Bible, this is talking in the language of people, and understand that when people try to make it so that it's not in the language of people,
this is the language of Marines. Are you kidding?
The language
Of course it is.
men.
Do you think he's talking to everybody, including tough soldiers?
No, that's not my point. I just
yeah, you wouldn't have thought
this is the book of laws.
You wouldn't have thought it's in the Bible.
If this is the book of laws, and the prophets are communicating the word of God, I like I said,
God made the donkeys and the stallions.
What, Rosemary?
I said God made the donkeys and the stallions.
Oh, that's not what I thought you said, but that's okay.
It's quite animated, Rosemary. I applaud you for that, but I just don't. Go ahead, fine, whatever.
No,
I guess out of everybody in this conversation, you'd be surprised that I'm the one bringing this up, but I just see no purpose of these discussions. That's all.
I will tell you, remember that this is not the Bible
Not a
is
children's book.
it's not for kids. And I guarantee you, yes, there are a lot of people who don't understand it and are missing the complexities. And again, to some extent, I mean, this is powerful stuff. This is not for the faint of heart, and it's not a game. It's not a game. And when he's trying to scare people into behaving better, he's not going to pull any punches. And that's why Ezekiel, to some extent, is one of my favorite prophets, because no other prophet does this. No other prophet, well, not describing it like this. There are other prophets who use prostitution and sex, as I already told you. You get to Hosea, our next prophet. But this one is really, really descriptive and upsetting, and literally trying to get you to just, like, if this doesn't hit you with language, what does? And so language is a very powerful tool that Ezekiel is a master of.
This is a question for the general public. At what point did this stop being an accepted way to describe prophecies, people, images, whatever? At what point did it become dirty?
You know something, Judith, there's so much in that question, because part of it was a rabbinic move away from language that, and always kind of was a difficult issue of comparing Israel to a woman, which definitely exists here. So
Right.
I completely have to go. I am sorry.
Okay. Thanks, Rosemary.
Everybody.
Sorry.
Hey, Rosemary.
Thank you for starting us on this. So we'll tape it for you. No, it is being recorded. But
We'll do a video.
Judith, there was, I think, during the rabbinic period, two things. One, there was at certain periods like a real attempt to not use language, especially feminine language, or even, well, to some extent, then the masculine language either, for things that dealt with God. So in this, the God is the groom, is the husband.
Right.
So there's a lack. There's a movement away from that. It does pop back into Judaism in the Zohar and in Kabbalistic writings, where we get the Sabbath as a bride, we get Israel as a bride, we get God as a man, married to us, the Torah as a woman. I mean, all of these things start to pop back into the Jewish mystical text. But during the rabbinic period, there's definitely a movement away from this type of literature. And to some extent, again, like the rabbis are, I'm not saying they're prudes, but they definitely were turned off of sexual language. Maybe because of their experiences with Romans and people who are very comfortable with sexual imagery. How do we know that? Because they put it on their walls. I mean, if you ever go to Pompeii, you can see the museum there of what was on the walls in Pompeii. The Romans were very open about sexuality, and it made the rabbis really even more uncomfortable to some extent. So that's part of it for sure. And then I think there's also this anthropomorphic, like moving away from any imagery of God in a male or female form, and us in a male or female form. So there was that. And then I think those are probably the two.
It could also be the Greeks who anthropomorphized. I mean,
before the Romans even, you had the Greeks, but but yeah, I mean, it's all Hellenistic, Greco-Roman stuff. But yes, that kind of stuff really turns them off, and so it was like you'd almost don't even talk about this stuff that's in the Bible because of that. And again, John, just so you know, most of the Bible, and you've now read through about half of it. We're standing about halfway through the corpus, if you will, of the biblical literature. The Torah through the first three prophets almost is literally halfway through the Bible. When we get into the minor prophets and then the Ketuvim, that's the last half, right? It's half of prophets, and then not quite. We're actually over half prophets, but almost right now, right about now. But anyways, you haven't seen that much graphic sexual imagery. There obviously is the Song of Songs, which is pretty much all sexual, though this image is even more graphic than some of the imagery and the normal imagery in Song of Songs. But Song of Songs is just a few chapters, and most of the time the Bible is not describing they're not describing sex. So it's not like the Bible's full of this, but when it is there, and especially in these scenes in Ezekiel, it's fairly graphic. It is unique. And again, because we said the Bible oftentimes talks, and when it comes to sex, talks in euphemism, especially as I showed you in Leviticus, when it talks about uncovering the nakedness. I mean, that's about as descriptive as the Bible gets with, sex.
I understand. I understand. I just
Yep. So when the description of Noah, where we're not even sure what happens because it's such a euphemism, that's the difference. And so here, yeah, it's all here. So
just
Judith,
like
why don't you continue? What? Sorry.
Just like Judith said, when did they become uncomfortable with? My point is what's the point of it?
I would say, well, Judith already told you part of it is poetry. Part of it's poetry.
Right. And it talks to the farmer. I mean, you always joke about the people always joke about the farmer and the grittiness and the earthiness, not grittiness of what happens on a farm. And so people got this. People understood this.
Really? So people really wanted to know what went inside a brothel? Really? That you think that was really,
I don't think they wanted to know. No, I don't think that was the issue. I think the issue that was how it was just a fact of the day. Like it wasn't titillating in the same way it is now. It was just, yeah, that's what happens. I mean, not that they liked it. Do you know what I mean? Not that it was.
I understand.
Yeah,
I understand.
But look, the reality is this is unusual. This is not the normal. This is not the normal language. But it's not the Bible never shies away from, graphic depictions of violence, graphic depictions of sex. It's not filled with it. And again, it's you have to think about the totality of it, how many pages there are, how many verses there are, and how much there actually is of this. Most of it's not there, but it's not that it's not, it's not that it's not there, right? And so again, the Torah itself might be a little bit more euphemistic, but other parts of the Bible, I mean, look, we read a story in the book of Judges, which again is not indicative of everything in the Bible, but we read the story of a woman who gets raped, a concubine. He'll get the same word we just read, Pelegesh, this concubine who got raped and raped to death in Judges chapter 19, raped to death, and her husband, or whatever you want to call him, her concubine, the husband in concubinage, cuts her up into 12 pieces and sends her out to the rest of the nation. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find something, like that in a Stephen King novel. I mean, it's
also not in apocryphal writings to the same extent.
Nope.
Right? It's not in the I'm trying to remember. I read them a long time.
It's not. And it makes its way occasionally in the Midrash because it's in the Torah, and so the Torah, has to be explained. But generally speaking, the Midrash doesn't get that graphic. It doesn't have to. But it's in the Midrash because the Midrash is going to deal with there's virtually no line of the Bible that the Midrash doesn't, in some case, touch. But it definitely, considering how we're still talking about it, the Midrash doesn't dwell on it. The Midrash doesn't have there's not pages of midrash describing, what Egypt. It's not there. But look, as we said, this issue of her youthful breasts, it's in the Haggadah, it's in the midrash that we read at Passover. So it's there. It's just it's not the only thing that's there, but it is there. It's not like the midrash ignored it. But generally speaking, the rabbis didn't. Judith's point is that during this period they didn't go around writing more of this. To some extent, they didn't engage in trying to be intentionally graphic, maybe a little violent, but not as sexual. That is true. But again, I think it's probably that Greco-Roman, how they got turned off of it from them in particular, and didn't want to have those kind of. But I would say that the amount of sexual content in the Bible is less than, look, we only found what we found archaeologically from the records of the Babylonians and the ancient Persians and the Canaanites. We only have a limited amount of that stuff, right? We don't have that much. But in this what we call ancient Near Eastern texts, ANET, in the ANET, there is more. We have a higher percentage of sexually graphic content than we do in the Bible. Doesn't mean that's. I don't want to make an assumption that's indicative of everything that we have. It's or everything that was there. But it is possible that for us and in our world, in Ezekiel's world, I'm talking about in the biblical period, in the ancient Near Eastern period from the Bronze Age, that we actually were less in our descriptions or in our biblical, in our texts, our legal texts, our poetic texts, our prophetic texts, that were less graphic than our neighbors were at the time. So based on what we have, seems that way, but I'm not going to say we can know for sure because we have a limited amount of stuff.
Well, the discussion about less graphic than our neighbors, that's a discussion for a whole nother time.
But I don't know that. I want to be careful. I don't want to say we know that for sure, but we know it from what we have. And so I'm not talking about the Greeks and Romans. I'm talking about Babylonians, Canaanites, those kind of people, Egyptians. So the Egyptians are.
Could it also be
overall less sexual, I think, than the Babylonians were, or at least from what we have. The Egyptians are a little less descriptive. They seem to, in my estimation, and you probably can guess this from the limited amount of Egyptian stuff that we're exposed to, which is usually some movie like The Mummy, but the Egyptians were a little highbrow. They were a little sophisticated. They didn't at least from the text that we have of the Egyptians, they didn't get down into it very much. They were a little bit more highbrow, but
was it also not in the literature, so to speak, because it was part of the religious rituals still? So it didn't belong in the literature, the writings?
For who? For us?
Well, because for the Babylonians and the Sumerians, the amount they had of.
Well, the weird thing is that most of the texts, at least that we have, where we even find it, I mean, we have not weird stuff. We have stuff that's like, lists of supplies and things like that. I'm not talking about like language places where you'd expect or where it could come up. If we have a lot of Babylonian texts that we found that are nothing to do with, they're literally lists of produce and grain and stuff like that. But for texts where you would have found it or where it kind of be comparable, yeah, I mean, it's there more, and they didn't seem to. Look, I'm not saying it's 100% there. I'm not saying it's 100% there. So I want to be careful that I'm not saying it's there, but at least we think that possibly to understand what they're talking about here, when it says that we saw, meaning Judah, when it's talking about Holibah, she saw men sculpted upon the walls, figures of the Chaldeans drawn in vermilion, girded with, that these depictions were ones that were, if not sexual, but maybe sexually provocative. Again, it's definitely exciting, a Holibah. I don't want to say for sure it's as sexual as it could be, but it could be that these pictures were sexually provocative pictures. Why do we say that? Because we have found some archaeological evidence that the Babylonians didn't have an issue depicting these kinds of things. We know India that they did, because we have found those places in India where you see statues of it, that are on a temple. So we do know that it's possible that, other cultures didn't have an issue with that. We don't have we don't even have a description in the Bible that those kind of pictures existed or those images existed in the Bible. But then again, our Bible pretty much just says they're all bad. All the images are bad. So we don't really know for sure whether the ones in Judah had sexual imagery, but it doesn't say that they did. It just says that whatever the statues were, they were abominations, and we don't really know. But it could be that, again, in other countries, they depicted these kinds of images of people having sex, or, imagery of, people nude, that they had an issue with. But we don't know for sure. We do know, by the way, as we've discussed before, that the land of Israel itself was filled at this time with figurines that were naked women, and we assume that they're fertility goddesses. And so those statues we know were all over the land of Israel. So the figurines of Astarte, they were everywhere, and we found them everywhere. And we've excavated sites all across Israel, in the north, the south, the east, the west, they're everywhere. And so the sexual, whether or not that was sexual or it was more fertility based, imagery to make us think about the Mother Earth, we don't know. I think it's probably the latter. I think it was more Mother Earth type fertility, but whatever, they are naked women. And so it is there. I mean, we found them. They're there. So Judith, if you want to continue for us, if you don't mind, we'll have Judith pick up with Aholibah.
Assuredly, Aholibah, thus said the sovereign God, I am going to rouse against you the lovers from whom you turned in disgust, and I will bring them upon you from all around. The Babylonians and all the Chaldeans, the people of Pekod, Shoah, and Koah, and all the Assyrians with them, all of them handsome young fellows, governors and prefects, officers and warriors, all of them riding on horseback.
Yeah, so again, you got sick of these guys, but I'm bringing them back to you. So that's even more ironic, graphic. Is it ironic? Don't you think? I don't know. I think it's ironic that these guys are not coming back, and they're the ones who are going to attack you.
They shall attack you with fleets of wheeled chariots and a host of troops. They shall set themselves against you on all sides with bucklers, shields, and helmets. And I will entrust your punishment to them, and they shall inflict their punishments on you. I will direct my passion against you, and they shall deal with you in fury. They shall cut off your nose and ears. The last of you shall fall by the sword. They shall take away your sons and daughters, and your remnant shall be devoured by fire.
That's pretty violently graphic.
They shall strip you of your clothing and take away your dazzling jewels. I will put an end to your wantonness and to your whoring in the land of Egypt, and you shall not long for them or remember Egypt anymore. For thus said the sovereign God, I am going to deliver you into the hands of those you hate. into the hands of those from whom you turned in disgust. They shall treat you with hate, and they shall take away all you have toiled for, and leave you naked and bare. Your naked licentiousness, wantonness, and whoredom will be exposed. These things shall be done to you for your whoring with the nations, for defiling yourself with their fetishes. You walked in your sister's path. Therefore, I will put her cup into your hand.
So, what does this mean? I will put her cup in your hand. Let's look at this phrase, because the next part begins Ko Amar Adonai, right? And you can see that the poetic structure changes a little bit now. So that buildup for the last verses now turns into something which the meter, the structure is a little different in the way that it goes, but this is your sister's, you shall drink of your sister's cup. So you walked in her path, now you will drink from her cup. Let's take a look.
Thus said the sovereign God, you shall drink of your sister's cup, so deep and wide. It shall cause derision and scorn. It holds so much. You shall be filled with drunkenness and woe, the cup of desolation and horror, the cup of your sister Samaria. You shall drink it and drain it and gnaw its shards, and you shall tear your breasts. For I have spoken, declares the sovereign God.
Yeah. If you look, we're not exactly sure what gnaw its shards is. I don't know if somebody has a different translation for that, if they want to share it.
You're chewing on the scraps. You're eating the scraps. Not only are you draining it, but you're licking it.
Yeah, it's probably, I mean, it seems logical that you're talking about drinking it and the dregs at the bottom, right? The dregs is chewing on the seeds, on the bits at the bottom of the cup, the bottom of the bottle, which is not a place you want to be. You don't want to be down there. And again, that's the phrase. And again, the phrase here, you shall tear your breasts. The word that's used over and over again for breasts are shadim, which in itself is an interesting cognate. The word shadim, yeah, is also possibly connected with the word Shaddai. Yeah. And so this is a tough one for us to know, because we God's referred to as El Shaddai all the way back in the book of Genesis, when the first time we have the phrase El Shaddai. We don't use the word Shaddai a lot, but it still has its place in liturgy occasionally, and in the shin that we put on our mezuzahs is the shin for Shaddai. And so there's a question of whether Shaddai is connected to the word shadim, which is breast. So is this God, one of God's names originate from breast? Is it a mountain, which is like a breast? And so it becomes like the Grand Tetons, and that God was the God of the mountains, the God of the breast, essentially. We don't know. We just know that the word Shaddai is connected the same 3-letter root as breast. So that's the phrase that we've had over and over again in Ezekiel in these last few chapters, has been the word breasts. Here it's again more tearing at it, which is what you do when you're upset and angry, and it's a symbol of extreme anguish, tearing one's breast. So
Assuredly, thus said the sovereign God, because you have forgotten me and cast me behind your back, you in turn must suffer for your wanton whoring. Then God said to me, O mortal, Arraign Ohala and Oholibah, and charge them with their abominations. For they have committed adultery, and blood is on their hands. Truly, they have committed adultery with their fetishes, and have even offered to them as food the children they bore to me.
That is, again, you read the cup imagery, and now back to these two sisters. The adultery, again, is compounded by the fact that God isn't just married to them. God had kids with them. And what did they do? They sacrificed those kids to these gods. And so this imagery that combines sexuality with violence, with religion, is making us think, oh, wow, yeah. You want to get the point home that child sacrifice was not just killing a person, but killing one of God's children. Not, you can't get much clearer than this. And of course, it means that it was being done. It's not here because they were doing it. So this is what this adultery was like, bad. But this is like, again, the consequence of this is what? Our kids were offered up to your adulterous person, your liaison. You offered up our children to him. That's the consequence. I mean, that's what's there.
At the same time, they also did this to me. They defiled my sanctuary and profaned my Sabbaths. On the very day that they slaughtered their children to their fetishes, they entered my sanctuary to desecrate it. That is what they did in my house.
Yeah. So they were worshiping me, and then they would go, after they literally did these child sacrifices, they come into my sanctuary. So again, the Mikdash, the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, had guys coming into it after they had sacrificed children. Same day. They're worshiping God. God's like, I know where you came from. I know what you did before you stepped into my house.
Rabbi, did you say they were sacrificing children?
Yeah.
I didn't read that.
Yeah, right here.
I read if you go to 36, in between 36 and 37, I read it to be that the females were, blood is on their hands, truly they've committed adultery with their fetishes and have even offered to them as food the children they bore to me.
Yeah,
well, I see what you're saying.
They're my kids. Your children. Your children are my children. I read, sacrifice them to the idols.
I read it more as they offered their children as prostitutes, not as
they offered them to the guys. And again, in this case, the other men in the relationship here for God are these idols.
Yeah.
And again, it's literally like, it's not just you cheated on me, you killed our kids for this guy. And then you came into my house after you did that.
Yeah.
It's terrible. And what they did was terrible. When we talk about, again, people have to remember, when we talk about idol worship, we approach it from the standpoint, well, so what? They were worshiping the wrong God. He was married to, they had a Christmas tree or something. That's what our idea of religions, of cultural sharing, of not being 100% that religion, whatever it is that you feel. I'm not gonna, whatever. I don't mean to be silly, is that we don't have any comprehension of this because, in our minds, first of all, everything's good, right? And everybody's religion is valid, and everybody's religion has to be accepted, and we have to cherish it, which I don't want to talk about today. But the reality is that when we're talking about the ancient world, and we're talking about specifically what Israel's talking about, worshiping another god meant cultural, it meant prostitution, cultic prostitution. It meant child sacrifice. This was stuff that today, everybody today, there's no part of the world where, we would say that's okay. But so just remember, this isn't like from our frame of mind of going, oh, what's the big deal? They were worshiping another god. That's what worshiping another god meant. That's why it couldn't be tolerated. That's why when we talk about, this campaign they're supposed to have had, where they wipe out the Canaanites, it's so that you don't do that. And it's too late already. It's too late. You already did it. You didn't wipe them out, and you behaved like them. So again, that's not, there is poetry here, but that is literal when it says that you sacrifice them. It's literal. That's what happens. And the Bible says it in non-poetic ways in the book of Kings. We read about kings of Israel and Judah who sacrificed their children, literally killed them. So, yeah, here we go.
Moreover, they sent for men to come from afar, men to whom a messenger was sent, and they came. For them, Oholibah, you bathed, painted your eyes, and donned your finery. And you sat on a grand couch with a set table in front of it, and it was my incense and my oil you laid upon it. And the noise of a carefree multitude was there, of numerous men brought drunk from the desert, and they put bracelets on their arms and splendid crowns upon their heads. Then I said, to destruction with adultery. Look, they are still going on with those same fornications of hers. And they would go to her as one goes to a prostitute. That is how they went to Oholah and Oholibah, wanton women. But righteous men shall punish them with the punishments for adultery and for bloodshed, for they are adulteresses and have blood on their hands. For thus said the sovereign God, summon an assembly against them and make them an object of horror and plunder. Let the assembly pelt them with stones and cut them down with their swords. Let them kill their sons and daughters and burn down their homes. I will put an end to wantonness in the land, and all the women shall take warning not to imitate your wantonness. They shall punish you for your wantonness, and you shall suffer the penalty for your sinful idolatry, and you shall know that I am the sovereign God.
Yep. So as you can see from that, again, this is a both literally and poetically, not just adultery, but also murder. When it says you have blood on your hands, it means, you killed people, you killed your own kids. So, yeah, we got to get rid of this. We have to get rid of this idolatry. So adultery, the idolatry is adultery. That's the way he phrases it. So we're going to read one more chapter today. We're going to finish with chapter 24, which is a little shorter than the last one. But we're going to finish with this because, again, when we come back next week, which I will be here for, and the week after, the week of the 14th of November, I'll be in Israel. I'm not 100% sure that we won't have class from Israel, but we're going to see. I don't want to say anything yet. It's too early to say, but we will have class next week in person, and then we'll see what happens the following week. But that's the only day that I would be in Israel. I mean, the only class day that I would be in Israel will be the 14th. I'd be back the 15th, which is the day we have Wednesday class. So we'll see. I'm not sure exactly where I'll be on that Tuesday, the 14th, but we'll see. But I would like to try to do it from Israel. We'll see. I don't know that I'm ever going to go on Israel time. So we'll, again, I don't know that I'll be sleeping much there. I do want to get to something that Judith just texted me, but I want her to read this last thing before we get to that, because it's something that amazingly we actually discussed on Wednesday. So let's take a look at chapter 24.
In the 9th year, on the 10th day of the 10th month, the word of God came to me. O mortal, record this date, this exact day, for this very day the king of Babylon has laid siege to Jerusalem. Further, speak in an allegory to the rebellious breed and say to them, thus said the sovereign God, put the cauldron on the fire, put it on, and then pour water into it. Collect in it the pieces of meat, every choice piece, thigh and shoulder. Fill it with the best cuts. Take the best of the flock, also pile the cuts under it. Get it boiling briskly and cook the cuts in it. Assuredly, thus said the sovereign God, woe to the city of blood, a cauldron whose scum is in it, whose scum has not been cleaned out. Empty it piece by piece. No lot has fallen upon it.
So let's look at what the notes on this say. So the first one is it scum or rust in the cauldron. The last phrase, no lot has fallen upon it. The word goral we know is the lot, and we have the word goral, and a lot in the Bible is a lot, but we're not really sure what the phrase means, right? So there's an idiom there to this whole image of the pot that we don't really understand, but the overall picture is one that we do understand, which is that the pot is Jerusalem. And we'll read a little bit more.
For the blood she shed is still in her. She set it upon a bare rock. She did not pour it out on the ground to cover it with earth. She set her blood upon the bare rock so that it was not covered, so that it may stir up my fury to take vengeance. Assuredly, thus said the sovereign God, woe to the city of blood. I, in turn, will make a great blaze. Pile on the logs, kindle the fire, cook the meat through, and stew it completely, and let the bones be charred. Let it stand empty on the coals until it becomes so hot that the copper glows. Then its impurity shall melt away in it, and its rust be consumed. It has frustrated all effort. Its thick scum will not leave it. Into the fire with its scum.
And that's why it seems like it's not just dirt or scum, but some type of rust or something where the whole pot has to be burned because it's not fixable. It's not cleanable anymore.
For your vile defilement, because I sought to purify you of your defilement, but you would not be purified. You shall never be pure again until I have satisfied my fury upon you. I, God, have spoken. It shall come to pass, and I will do it. I will not refrain or spare or relent. You shall be punished according to your ways and your deeds, declares the sovereign God.
Yep. And so there you can see like the end of that first part, the prophecy, this prophecy of of the pot of the you know. So yeah, that's the first part of it. The pot. Jerusalem is a pot, right? We've seen imagery of pottery, of cookware. This is definitely metal, and we already read about about metal being burned, but this is both because it cooked these things, and now it itself is going to be cooked. So it's not like going from the fire from the frying pan to the fire. It's that the frying pan is going to be burned. That's how hot it's going to get, if you will. It's not like you in the frying pan or in the pot are going to get now out of the pot. The pot itself is going to burn. Yeah. So here is the next part of this chapter, which is a different prophecy.
The word of God came to me. O mortal, I'm about to take away the delight of your eyes from you through pestilence, but you shall not lament or weep or let your tears flow. Moan softly. Observe no mourning for the dead. Put on your turban and put your sandals on your feet. Do not cover over your upper lip and do not eat the bread of comforters.
So what are we talking about here? Well, not having Brents, right, John? No Brents for you. You're mourning, but you're not getting Brents. There's no food for you, but obviously,
Unfortunately,
it's all the bad parts, but none of the good parts, right? There's no help here coming,
No
and
help,
there's
comforters.
no way to grieve properly. What does this remind us of? I mean, at least there's a story in the Bible that we were actually almost have these exact same words, which are, you're not going to mourn, right? You don't mourn. Remember?
Esther?
Aaron's sons, right?
Oh, Aaron's sons, right.
Nadav and Abihu are killed. God tells Moses, tell Aaron, there is no mourning. There is no mourning for them. You take care of business now. You fix the temple and the Mishkan, the sanctuary, the tabernacle. You fix it, clean it up, but you're not going to mourn. And that was one of the hardest parts of that, is that he can't even mourn for his kids. So, and the words that are used here are really those kind of like harken back to that, which is put on your turban, right? Put on your hat, which is what the priests wore. Priests wore a hat. And so it reminds us of that scene a little bit of Nadav and Abihu for Aaron.
In the evening, my wife died, and in the morning I did as I had been commanded. And when I spoke to the people that morning, the people asked me, will you not tell us what these things portend for us, that you are acting so?
So what just happened? What just happened? What just happened? We don't know anything about Ezekiel's life. We not like Jeremiah. We don't know a lot about Jeremiah's family life, but we don't know anything about anything about what happens to him, really. We only read what God tells him to do, and the things that he's telling us about the way God makes him do the prophecies. So what just happened? I mean, what is it? Well, you can see what he just said. He said, my wife died, and I
didn't mourn her.
I didn't mourn her. That's what it says. Um, uh, this was not it doesn't seem like this was, it doesn't seem like from verse 15 on, or 16 on, or 15 was the introduction, but it doesn't seem like this was like a metaphor. It doesn't seem like this is imagery. This seems like this really happened. That he died, that she died. That the light from your eyes is your wife. So,
Well,
by the way, you heard, Judith, my wife has COVID, but she's not,
she already texted me. I know.
she's not,
She's not sick.
she's not, God, that would be terrible that I said that now,
Yes.
but, but yes, God did not tell me that, but God just told him his wife is going to die before she died.
But suppose you replace wife with Jerusalem.
I know. Listen, I know it's possible, but it doesn't seem like, I mean, clearly that's what you're supposed to do, right? He's supposed to teach them that because the people ask him about it, which means that like that line just told us that this really happened. That his performance, like we read about his stuff that he did, about how he laid down on the ground and, he built a model of Jerusalem, and he makes this poop bread on poop, whatever, all of those things he did. But this, his wife dies and it's teaching a lesson to people. He's supposed to teach a lesson to people. This is pretty tough. Because of course it also implies that her death, you can make the argument she's going to die anyways, and God just uses this as an example, but definitely seems to be part of God's plan. So it's tough. It's a tough one because he's now got to lead by example and teach by example and teach the people, like you said, they're going to have to do this, Judith, now for Jerusalem. But wow. So what's his response? This is the last part we'll read today.
I answered them, the word of God has come to me. Tell the house of Israel, thus said the sovereign God, I'm going to desecrate my sanctuary, your pride and glory, the delight of your eyes and the desire of your heart. And the sons and daughters you have left behind shall fall by the sword. Accordingly, you shall do as I have done. You shall not cover over your upper lips or eat the bread of comforters. And your turbans shall remain on your heads and your sandals upon your feet. You shall not lament or weep, but you shall be heartsick because of your iniquities and shall moan to one another. And Ezekiel shall become a portent for you. You shall do just as he has done when the predicted punishment happens, and you shall know that I am the sovereign God. You, O mortal, take note. On the day that I take their stronghold from them, their pride and joy, the delight of their eyes, and the longing of their hearts, their sons and daughters, on that day a fugitive will come to you, to let you hear it with your own ears. On that day, your mouth shall be opened to the fugitive, and you shall speak and no longer be dumb. So you shall be a portent for them, and they shall know that I am God.
And that's coming in a few chapters. The message that they've all been waiting for, which is that Jerusalem is destroyed. It's coming. And now you're going to do what Ezekiel did, which is you're going to be upset, but you're not going to mourn the way we normally mourn, because you're going to carry this with you in a way that you're going to have to process it. this is not a normal death. And so all of this, again, gets back to, look, Judith, you said, take the word Jerusalem and it's, put it into your wife. It says the delight of your eyes. It's the same phrase. Jerusalem is the delight of my sanctuary, the light of your eyes. So yeah, this is now again, I'm about to take away the delight of your eyes. So it's not hard to figure out what the message is. I mean, it's not hidden. It's not, you don't have to guess. It says. So yeah, it's Ezekiel's, and Ezekiel actually talks about himself or in the third person, or God says it, and they say, well, maybe this verse, goes ahead of verse 24, comes before verse 22. It seems out of order, but the point is that Ezekiel, this is as we were reading the earlier ones of what Ezekiel does, and in my head, I'm like, wait till you see wait till you see what happens here when his wife dies, and he's basically can't mourn her. He wants to mourn her. He would have mourned her, but he can't. And again, we don't learn a lot about Ezekiel, but about his life and about what he does, but in his spare time. But this we know. This is what happened to him. Now, before we wrap up, I thank you, Judith, by the way, for reading. But you made a comment earlier to me about Amalek. Just so you know, for those who are here right now, a few people who are here right now who are on the line who were with us on Wednesday, we actually read about Amalek on Wednesday. That the section we're on Wednesday is the section about Amalek. It's the section that we read on Shabbat Zachor, right before Purim. It's the section that reminds us, chapter 22, that the Amalekites, I'll show it to you right now so you can see it. Sorry, chapter 25. Let me just show you the part that we read. It's the Maftir. It's the last 3 verses of chapter 25. Remember what Amalek did to you on your journey after you left Egypt. How, undeterred by fear of God, how they surprised you when you were famished and weary, cut down the stragglers in your rear. Therefore, when your God grants you safety from your enemies, right, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. So we just read this. We read this. Read it 2 weeks ago, not last week, the week before. Yeah. So Judith, what did you want to say about that? Judith?
Sorry. The tradition is that you're supposed to wipe out Amalek.
Yep.
Completely wipe out Amalek, and that the Israelites did not do that completely.
Yep.
And so that all of our enemies of all the generations are equated to Amalek.
Yep.
Haman, Haman,
Yep.
Amalek.
Hitler.
So my comment was
Hitler's Amalek, Stalin's Amalek.
Hitler,
yeah.
Amalek, all of everybody. It's
Yep.
enemy of the Jewish people is Amalek.
Yes.
So I sent a text to Mark that in today's world, we have a new Amalek.
Yeah. And the Torah is pretty insistent that we have no choice, right? who is Amalek? It's people who self-identify. This was my point. This is what I said on Wednesday. People who self-identify, who hate Jews, are Amalek. So we don't tell people they're Amalek. They tell us that they're Amalek. They come forward and they identify themselves. And Amalek does this, which is they attack the most vulnerable people, and that's what they do. If they're given the opportunity, they do that. So these are not soldiers. These are not people who went into battle and beat you in a battle. These are people who kill the women and children and the elderly and the people who were at the back of the march as we left Egypt. As we mentioned too, one of the things the Amalekites did is that they were able to lower the prestige of Israel. Israel had just defeated the Egyptians, the greatest army in the world. And now this little band of desert nomads, raiders, attacks them, which basically sends a message to everybody else throughout history that you can attack us. So this is also sends a message of this, which again is fairly relevant to the world we live in today, which is when we look at what happened 3 weeks ago, we see this issue of what happens when we are attacked, especially the most vulnerable in our society are attacked. That for some people, interestingly, that sends a message that we can all be attacked. And so I think it's really important for us to remember this lesson of Amalek. Again, I didn't say Hamas is Amalek. They said it. They did it. They made themselves Amalek. And so we really don't have a choice. We have to make it so that they don't exist anymore, so that Hamas is gone. And we have no choice. We don't have a choice. It's not God telling us this. It's history telling us this. It's rational thought telling us this. It's basic observance of behavior and consequential, I would say, the imperative, the ethical imperative that you have to survive. Everything else goes out the window because, as somebody told me yesterday, and they're agonizing over this issue themselves, if you're dead, what difference does it make whether you agree on principles? And that's, of course, what Israel was faced with, because they were, as we know, Israel was the most fractious point in its history in the last year, that nothing else matters at this point. Judicial, oversight, the Supreme Court of Israel means nothing if we can't protect the lives of women and children and the elderly, the people that Amalek attacked and killed. If you can't fix that, if you can't deal with that, and you have to now, and again, I am not advocating for the wholesale destruction of life, but there's an imperative to do this, and we don't really have a choice. So, obviously some people don't understand that, which is one of the other things that Amalek did, which is not only attack us, but cause us to be, to have a lack of fear amongst other people, because if they can get away with it, then anybody can get away with it. So I know that's not necessarily what people want to hear, but it's the truth. And the reality is that we knew it 3,000 years ago, or at least 2,000 years ago, when we wrote the Midrash on this stuff. But I think the Torah is cognizant of it, even though the Torah doesn't say, this is what Amalek did, but it does, it says they surprised you on, and did that. But, this is unfortunately, where we're at right now. And again, I'm going to say, I didn't say they're Amalek. They said they're Amalek. I didn't.
They showed themselves to be Amalek.
They made it. So, they made it. So, I don't know what to tell you other than it's not a good situation that we have to deal with. Yeah, so tomorrow night we will be reading the rest of moving into the next sections of Devarim, of Deuteronomy, and then next week we'll be back in person and online. So thank you, Judith, for finishing up our reading. And again, we'll stay safe and try to stay moving in the right direction. You know, hopefully we'll have better news in the coming days. And we have services with Wendy Shabbos. So take care, everybody. See you soon.
All right. Thank you.
Stay healthy.
Thank you.
Stay healthy. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.